So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Shawkat Toorawa. Professor Shawkat Toorawa received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He has taught Arabic at Duke University, medieval French literature, and Indian Ocean Studies at the University of Mauritius, and Arabic and other literatures at Cornell University. He joined Yale as a professor of Arabic in 2016 and currently serves as the director of the School of Abbasid Studies. He also serves as a series editor of resources in Arabic and Islamic studies, and is on the editorial and advisory boards of several journals, including the Journal of Abbasid Studies, the Journal of Arabic Literature, and the Journal of Qur'anic Studies. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome you to our conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I would like to start with some macroscopic questions about your career and how you got into Arabic literature. So I kind of wanted to start really at the beginning. So what sparked your interest in Arabic, and how did you get into translation as a field?
When I was deciding what to study in university, I went to school in Singapore at an international school, and I was trying to decide what to study. My first set of choices was whether to go to England, which is where almost everyone in my school went, or elsewhere. And when I learned that in England, one had to already pick one's course of study, and that in the United States, one didn't have to, I thought the US would be a better bet. And I was, in fact, I think the first, maybe the only non-American at my school who chose to apply to the United States. This was back in 1980. And I thought to myself, I wanted to study a language. And the short list in my head was Gujarati, which is the ancestral or cultural language of my family, which they never spoke to me. And so I was always, I'm not bitter anymore, but I always wondered why my parents didn't ever speak that, although we spoke several other languages. Another thought was Arabic, because I had, as a young child, been taught to read it in order to read the Qur'an and in order to recite it. And another thought, which was triggered by someone saying to me, well, if you're going to study Arabic, shouldn't you be going to the Arab world? The thought that if I was going to go to the US, I should study an American language. And so I thought I would study Hopi. And what I then did before the age of the internet is I tried to identify universities that taught two of those three languages. And that narrowed it down considerably, as you can imagine. And I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania. I should say that I did have an idea of going to the Arab world. I had the idea of going to AUB. And in 1980, my father looked at me and said, as you know, you can go anywhere you want in the world. But have you been reading the newspapers? You cannot go to Beirut. And it was gut-wrenching, because I'd been going to Beirut as a child when we used to live in France. It was the one place my father used to take me. And it was my dream, was one day to go to university in Beirut. And that was, but I understood. And I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania and to study Hopi, Gujarati, and Arabic. And Roger Allen, the legendary Roger Allen, said to me, stop wasting your time learning Gujarati, because you can always learn that. It's your language, it's your ancestral language. And the Hopi professor is on leave, do Arabic. And that sealed it for me.
Oh, really? Okay. And then how did you get into translation in particular? Why not be just study the works in general and kind of do a more of an anthropological read?
In a class with Roger Allen, he was actually not my Arabic teacher for the first several years. The first 3 years, I had a series of spectacular teachers, Nazi Daher, Bill Granara, and others, Adil Alouche. But when I took seminars with Roger Allen, in one seminar, we were reading Adonis. And our Arabic was good, but we were also reading it with translation. And I thought the translations were awful. And I said to Professor Allen, to Dr. Allen, which is what we called him, I think I need to retranslate Adonis. And he said, well, it's kind of a tall order. And I actually picked some of the long poems, but that's what I set about to do. And then realized that this was something that was sorely needed in Arabic. The situation is very different now than it was in 1983, 1984. But back then, there was very little by way of poetry and prose. And of course, he had already made a name as a Mahfuz translator and other things. But so it was also the fact that I was surrounded or was in the company of people for whom translation was an important way of bringing Arabic literature to the world.
And then, is there a skill set or a trait that you think makes a really good translator, or what stands out to you as a practice that needs to be kind of central in translating?
So I think my answer to that question, or those questions, would have been very different before 2010, 2011, when I joined the Library of Arabic Literature and got involved in deep conversations about what it means to translate a text. and what it means to translate an Arabic text, and then especially what it means to translate a pre-modern Arabic text. But I think it's fair to say that there were things I was doing all along, so I'll mention those first. One of them was to always show my work to others. I think one difficulty is people think, and I think this is true of scholarship generally, that it's something that they can do alone. It can be solitary, and sometimes one wishes to retreat and do it. But all, to my mind anyway, all or maybe almost all good scholarship is scholarship that has been read by colleagues, friends, peers, and all good translations have been looked at or vetted or responded to by people one trusts, who are willing to give serious feedback. That's certainly the practice of the Library of Arabic Literature, where we give, I think some people might call it intrusive feedback, but it's because we feel that the end product will be better. I think there's an interview floating somewhere with me where or maybe it's not an interview, but an account in which I said 2 heads are better than 1. And I think that's true. And I don't know, by which I don't mean to diminish the skill of some spectacular translators. The ones that come immediately to mind: Humphrey Davis, Yasmin Seal, Tim McIntosh Smith, about whom I think we'll be speaking shortly. But even there, they rely on sometimes their partners, sometimes their colleagues, sometimes their editors at the press. They rely on these people to give them a kind of read. So that's important. I mean, there are other things that are obvious, like it will be helpful if one knew the language quite well. I was stunned in college to read Sadiq Hidayat's The Blind Owl, which is translated from Persian, and to learn that it had been translated from French, not from Persian. Because the translator had translated from French. And this is not a criticism. There were structural impediments, and it was better that the work appeared than it not appear. The same was true, at least at the time, of Ismail Kadare, the Albanian writer, who's a writer I really enjoyed. And I didn't realize at first that he had been translated from the French. This happens. But obviously a command of the language, willingness to let other people read the material, and maybe most importantly, a recognition that one can't be slavishly tied to Arabic syntax or to the syntax of any language one is translating. I think we run into this problem frequently, and it's because we think, or we can hear the Arabic behind it, and we know many of our readers can hear the Arabic behind it, and so it ends up being praised. A particular sentence can be praised as a sort of a accurate, faithful, these words that people like to use, translation, without thinking about what it might mean to put it in English that would be more maybe productive and fruitful and useful. So that's a struggle for me. So I'm sure it's a struggle for others as well.
I know you had even mentioned in an interview that you like to give your daughter the translation, and if it doesn't make sense to her, then it's
in fact, that's something James Montgomery used to do, perhaps still does as well. We're partners in crime in this, although we translate quite differently. I mean, and I think that's a great sign of this, is that we agree almost completely on the principles, but there is no way that anyone could describe the way that he translates and the way that I translate as being in any way similar. And so it's about a set of practices, not a way of rendering into English. That started in my case, showing my daughter, it started with the Qur'an, which is something that I have now been translating for quite a while, bits and pieces here and there. And I actually have a book coming out of translations next year, I guess. And even in that case, I wasn't even willing to show it to a press until I'd shown it to a poet and translator, in this case, Peter Cole, who is, a fantastic poet and a fantastic translator, because I needed to know what his response as a poet and translator would be, because I'm a translator, but I'm an academic translator, and I'm certainly no poet. So, but yeah, it started with Quran. I remember showing passages from the Quran to my daughter, and she looked at me, and she was 13, 14, and she said, "I have no idea what this means." I said, "Yeah, nor do I," meaning the English. And we set about to try and translate we started with Surah Baqarah to try and do it for children, but then we ran out of steam, and she got busy and I got busy, and we decided, maybe we'd revisit it. In the meantime, people have translated the Quran for children. I'm happy to report. I believe it's Mustafa Khattab, and it's spectacular because it finally takes the language and turns it into form that children will understand. And in a way, that's the model, right? You need to think about who your audience is and how will you make them understand it. I should just say that another thing that drives my thinking about translation is, we take classic texts, important texts that Arabs, Arabists, scholars, literature scholars say, oh, this is a great text. Whether it's the Risalat al-Ghufran or whether it's a Mutanabbi poem or whether it's the Qur'an or whatever. And then we as a community tolerate subpar translations. And fine, that sometimes is a product of the translator, of the publisher, whatever. But the problem is that it gives the world that doesn't have access to the original the impression that these are not literary giants or amazing pieces of literature, because they read it and they go, well, okay, what's the big deal? Yeah. And that's a burden. I think, I don't want Farabi to sound like a dork, right? I don't want Abu Nuwas to sound pedestrian, right? And I don't want the Quran to sound less than, full of gravitas and quirky. Right. So, yeah.
Touching on something that you had mentioned, you said that you have a different practice of translating or philosophy of translating than some of your counterparts. Can you talk through a little bit of like how your philosophy or your practice, or if you're about to begin translating something, what's the thing that you're usually thinking about or processing at that time?
So it will depend on the text, which will depend on the audience, the intended audience for that text. It will sometimes depend on the publisher and what the publisher or the publisher has in mind. I think the simplest way to say is, you're not speaking about selection of texts, right? You're speaking about actual practice. I would say the first thing I do is I do a draft in sometimes of only a bit of it, in whatever, using whatever principles I've decided apply, and then I immediately show it to people. Those people I can name because it's a small group. It's Joe Lowry, Devin Stewart, James Montgomery, Philip Kennedy, Chip Rossetti, Lucy Taylor. I mean, it's a relatively small group, and it depends. Some texts go to some people, some texts go to others. Probably the ones who've seen the most are Joe Lowry and Devin Stewart, and because I was in graduate school with them, because they're close friends, and importantly, because they're willing to take the 5 hours out of their lives that it's going to take to go over a very short text to say, is there a way I can help him improve this? And they're also not worried about saying, this just doesn't work. You need to go back to the drawing board, right? And, this is as much about suhbah and friendship and scholarship as it is about translation.
Right. And I've seen in a lecture of yours that you also like had an example of like translating the Qur'an, and you kind of like had highlighted to yourself like, oh, this is where a certain vowel repeats, and this is how I want to match that.
Right now with Qur'an, or with things that are very metrical, or things that are very where there's a lot of repetition, or there are things that are going on that I feel I need to somehow convey, but that I acknowledge I cannot convey in a one-to-one correspondence, because that would then be to be slavishly tied to the Arabic syntax. I try to identify ways. So for example, with Surah Tariq, when I did it, which by the way is not a translation with which I'm happy. But what I did is I realized that there were, not only were there ism fa'il, active participle endings, right? So the sound Tariq, right, for example, at the end, but in the word tara'ib or sara'ir, you also have that shape at the end. And so what I tried to do is in the English, find strategies to repeat certain things, although obviously I could not repeat the active participle in English, because that would have not worked or meant anything. And I've done other things in some surahs, but I would say this is mainly when I work with Quran translation. When I've done others, when I've done not Quran or prose, I've done different things. And when I translated Adonis, which actually is now a very long time ago, I mean, I've translated him since, but the bulk that I did a long time ago, there I was very concerned about the way he organized the lines on the page, what words he ended a line on. And so I was, I guess I changed the characterization from, slavishly tied to attentive to and alert to certain choices that he made. He obviously wanted certain sounds to come at the end. And if the folks out there who've criticized that translation criticize it for that reason, and those who have praised that translation have praised it for that same reason.
Right, right.
So therein is the paradox.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So it does translate to poetry as well. The other thought that I had when you were kind of saying this is that you also kind of like need a deep understanding and a deep command of the language you're translating to. Because there was like one translation that I saw that you used a word that I never heard of, and it was to kind of like convey like the uniqueness of even using that word in Arabic too, right? Can you speak a little bit about that and like how it kind of feels like?
Well, so there is a I don't know whether people still think this is a sine qua non, but I think it's fair to say as a generalization that one should have native command of the language in which one is translating into.
Right.
And whether one has native command of the language from which one is translating is a separate question. Right. Ideally, one is fully native in two languages. Very few people are fully native in two languages. I grew up speaking two languages and then three, but English is clearly dominant. Mm-hmm. And so it would not really occur to me to translate into any language other than English. Mm-hmm. So I have translated Lorca from Spanish. I've translated Mauritian Creole from Mauritian Creole. I've translated from Arabic. And I have only ever translated one thing into French, and it's about 4 lines long. And I've only ever tried my hand at composing a poem. I'm not a poet, but in order to become I believed to become a better translator of poetry, I started spending a lot of time with the craft of poetry. And so I took a poetry writing seminar in graduate school, just because I wanted to translate better, not because I thought I was a poet, which I'm not. And I tried translating poems from one language into another to understand the craft of poetry better. So I've written one poem in French just to see what that involves. And I've written one poem in Spanish and one poem in Creole and one poem in Arabic, right? Mm-hmm. The only languages I feel comfortable doing something like this in. But absolutely, you have to have native command of the language you're translating into, the so-called target language. That is the language that is going to be read. And that is what is going to be read by people. Those people are typically going to be native speakers of that language. Of course, one runs certain risks, if one uses words that no one has heard of or people haven't used. But as you point out, I did it in that case for a specific reason. To use the Quran as an example, again, the Quran has I've studied the hapaxes, the words that occur only once in the Quran. And there are some 300 and some. And so I told myself that if ever I translated the Quran in its entirety, which I will never do because I've decided not to, I would want there to be at least 300 English hapaxes in it, just to also have that feature.
Right.
So that's luzum ma la yalzam, right? That's imposing on myself something that is not necessary, but it is a feature of the original text.
Right.
It doesn't have to be the same 300 words, 380 words, right? But just to have that. And so, but you run risks. You run risks of estranging people as well, and people saying, well, that's a weird word to use there.
Out of curiosity, why have you decided not to translate the Quran its entirety?
Well, there's a hostile answer and a non-hostile answer. The hostile answer is because everyone and their sister and their brother seems to think, or certainly every Muslim academic seems to think that they have to translate the Quran. And, and so it's a very large bandwagon right now. A new one comes out every year. Right. The less hostile, not hostile, I don't mean hostile, I mean, that whatever answer that is. The other answer is, unless you can bring something new to the table, I see no reason to retranslate the whole thing.
Got it.
And very few people have brought something new to the table.
Got it.
I tried to in my translations in the Journal of Quranic Studies. Those were directed at academics. They were an attempt to give academics who wanted to teach the Quran the possibility of using translations that rhymed, but they're very wooden. And so, so the book that I'm working on reworks those, thanks to the input of poet and translator and friends. And even that book only amounts to about 12% of the Quran. And what I decided to do, some people said to me, we think you should do it. And I said, I don't think I have the energy or the skill, but I'm willing to work on the surahs that matter to me. Right. And in trying to delineate which ones to
Right.
But I had to work out which ones mattered and then to delineate it for a book. I realized the ones to which I had unwittingly been attracted were the ones that matter to Muslims.
Oh,
By which I mean, if you look at Western scholarship or even non-Western scholarship of the modern scholarship of the Quran, certain surahs matter. Surah Nisa matters for obvious reasons to Quranic studies experts and to scholars. Surah Baqarah matters. Surah Yusuf matters. And I was interested in the ones that Muslims regularly read devotionally. And so I've carved out those surahs, and the good Lord willing, that will appear, and I will be satisfied that I have brought something new to the table. That is, I've carved out a corpus that is not the one that people usually think about, the devotional surahs, and I'll have done with them, to the extent of my ability as a non-poet, what I can do to at least open up the Quran a bit to a readership and have it sound, at least to my ear and the ear of the people I've shown it to, like something that has the requisite gravitas. And poetic quality.
Yeah. Kind of related to that question, but how do you choose what works you translate? Is it something that comes out of an intellectual curiosity? Is it something that comes out of like a general curiosity? Like how do you choose those works?
I don't remember who it was that said, we don't choose the works we translate, they choose us. Maybe everyone says that. I think, it's often an accident of some kind, right? So as I explained, the Adonis was purely because, the real actual reason was not just that I didn't like the translations, is that the people in the seminar didn't like Adonis.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand it. And it made no sense to me. And so I thought, is it because of the translation? Is it because they found it hard? What is it? And so there it was partly an attempt on my part as a kind of, upstart young Arabist, because I didn't really know Arabic properly yet, trying to intervene in a way. So that, in a way, Adonis found me because Roger Allen assigned it. With the Quran, as I say, it was because I was listening to a surah being recited, and my uncle said to me, "What surah is that?" And he didn't know Arabic, and I showed him the translation. I thought translation was terrible. And I thought, I should really, he said, you should really translate these things. And I thought, maybe I should start translating little snippets and try to do something. So that was also, it was an occasion in which that happened. In the case of, one of the things I translated was not a literary work. It was a work from French, a work of scholarship from French into English. When I had done my dissertation work and my research, I encountered the work of Gregor Schurler, which was only available then in German. My German's not great, but I, struggled through it. And one day at a conference, Beatrice Grundler said, and in Schurler's latest work, Écrire et transmettre dans les débuts de l'Islam, he says such. And I said, wait a minute, that's in French. So I went up to her and I said, he has a work in French? She goes, yeah, he published his lectures. And I said, I read it. It was fantastic. I contacted the press and I said, this is a resume of his life's work, or one aspect of his work. I think we should publish this. I'm happy to translate it. And I'm comfortable translating from French. So that was a desire on my part to make his scholarship available to Anglophone world. At exactly the same time, James Montgomery and Uwe Wackelpohl decided to translate his German articles into English. And so suddenly Schurler became available to the Anglophone world. So that was a move on, a scholarly move, as it were. My family's from the island of Mauritius, and I found myself living. I had never lived there, but I married a Mauritian, and I ended up. Our kids were born there, actually, but I ended up living there for 4 years, and I did not know whether I would be able to do my work in Arabic as well and deeply as I could if I were based at a university with a large library. And this was before the internet made things simpler. And so I got invested in Mauritian literature and Creole language literature, which was still being poo-pooed at the time that I lived there. Now it has much more status. And I decided I would translate Mauritian literature as well. And so I've translated from Creole. So, I guess, it sounds a bit megalomaniacal, so I feel bad saying this, but I think in a way it's at points where I felt that bringing such a work to a readership was important. And if I was going to be the medium or the conduit of that, then so be it.
And then kind of touching on something that you had mentioned with the Qur'an and, like the works that you were most attracted to were ones that had more resonance with Muslims. Does your spirituality inform your translation practice, or If it does, how does it, how so?
I can't imagine that it informs, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought about this. I can't imagine that it informs, my translations of everything, because it doesn't, I don't know how I'm necessarily bringing that to the table. But, I wrote a piece some years back in response to another piece. I was invited to write a response to a piece about, in a special issue of Religion and Literature, about the religious turn in medieval scholarship. And the article I responded to by Suzanne Akbari was her reflecting on the fact that her choices as a scholar, she thought were not a function of her religious identity, but in the end were, and she was distancing certain things and approaching certain things. And I, in my response, realized the same thing. And one of the things I say in that piece, which is called, her piece is called Objects of Devotion. My piece is called Objection to Devotion, in which I talk a little bit about how people respond to me as a Muslim who studies Arabic. So people assume I study Islam, even though I don't really. But one of the things I realized was I too had made the same choices without realizing it. So I am someone who considers himself observant, or as I say in that piece, observed to be observant. But I seem to have picked, I picked Adonis. One day when I mentioned that I was teaching Adonis to someone in Malaysia, they said, "Why are you studying an atheist?" The person I wrote my dissertation on, Ibn Abi Tahir, who lived in 9th century Baghdad, is just about the only person you can find who has made no statement about anything religious or written any religious text. I mean, it's just, and so I began to wonder, was I distancing myself without realizing it from this? But I don't think I was. I just think I'm interested in literature. I'm not interested in religious literature. I don't really think that my religious commitments influence in any way that I'm fully aware of my choices of things to translate or things to study or things to read. This is complicated, has been complicated in recent years because I was brought in by Roger Allen to co-edit a volume on Islam. I was brought in by Cambridge University Press to co-edit a volume on the Hajj. And then I started working on Qur'an. And so people look at me and say, well, you can pretend that you're not interested in Islam. But, being interested in Islam as a civilizational enterprise, construct, phenomenon is very different from being interested in religious literature and religion. And so I think I can say with complete confidence, I do not work on religion. Right. But I cannot say that Islam does not find its way into what I'm doing. You can't read Adonis without knowing Islam. Because you run the risk of, if you're translating Adonis, you run the risk of him knowing more about Islam than you. And that's a problem if you're trying to convey what he's trying. And of course, the chances are very high that he knows more about Islam than his translators. So, so it's fascinating, that kind of journey with, and I say Islam just because I'm Muslim. I think if I were Christian, it would be about Christianity. It would be different in Arabic literature, or Jewish, or Zoroastrian, or an atheist, or whatever one's commitments are. How can one not be bringing that to the table? One must be.
Yeah. Last question before we get into some of your books. What's the hardest work you've had to translate and why?
The hardest work I've had to translate. Well, again, I believe someone has said this. The hardest work to translate is the one you just finished. Right? And so it feels that way. It took 20 years to translate Surah Rahman. So that's one form of hard. Another form of hard is agonizing over a single word for months and then suddenly realizing or failing and having to go with whatever word one ends up with. I think because I've translated so many very different things, I mean, I don't know, I think if you asked a world-class translator who works in a genre, I don't know, Rabassa with Marquez or something, you're probably going to get a very different answer from an academic translator who decides to take things on. Everything is hard. And I don't need to tell you or your audience, Arabic is hard. And so, well, at least it is for me. And so it's all pretty hard. But the biggest challenge has been the Quran because of my concern about the audience reaction. So that's been hard in a very different way. Are people going to take exception to this? Are people going to think he doesn't know what he's talking about? Are people going to think he's trying to demean or devalue the word of God? And that hovers. And so that's a kind of difficulty that has been the most oppressive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I do see that with artists as well when it comes to Muslim reception.
Yeah, it's always so. I do it under a pseudonym. I just recently, I should mention this because it's so fun. I recently translated Surah Yusuf as a play script. So instead of saying Qala Yusuf, Qala, they're all listed as names, and then there are parts. And I of course circulated this to Devin Stewart, Joe Lowry, and Nora Schmid because we were meeting and talking about things. And we just did a read through of it.
Oh, wow.
Live in Palermo, the International Quranic Studies Association. And it was a spectacular success. But in the months leading up to it, at one point, Joe Lowry said to me, are we doing this under pseudonyms or how is this going to happen exactly, right? Because there's always this kind of, not fear, but this concern that one will offend. And I'm not trying to offend anyone.
Right, right.
I'm trying to actually show what is beautiful about the text.
Right.
But it's always possible that,
right.
people...
But to do that takes a risk and it takes a foray and it takes...
Yeah, and translation is risk-taking. Or to quote Robin Cresswell, translation, my colleague here at Yale, who's also a great translator and teacher and reader of poetry, he says translation is damage control. which when he said that, in fact, he said it at a meeting of the editors of the Library of Arabic Literature. We were learning about how to translate with Richard Seaberth, and Robin was present, and I think Peter Cole was present. And when he said that, just thought, wow, that is exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
Damage control.
Right.
And then try and get the thing that you can present.
Right. Just to add context before we move to the next slide for readers, this is from the Met. This is a manuscript from the late 9th, early 10th century in Kufic script, just to add context to what we've been looking at for the past few minutes. But moving into some of the books that you've worked on. This is A Physician in the Nile. You said that you had picked this title and it's near and dear to your heart. So
I have the unbelievable privilege of being on the editorial board and the executive board of the Library of Arabic Literature. And so, of course, titles are proposed to us by people, but we also come up with titles that we want to commission. And I speak under correction, but I'm pretty sure I'm the one who proposed this title. And even if I didn't, it's fine. It may well have been Tim McIntosh Smith who proposed it, who's a spectacular translator. When I was in graduate school, I got very interested in this figure, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who was a physician and a philosopher and a grammarian and a traveler. I read his autobiographical passages in Ibn Abi Usaybiya's Uyun al-Anba fi Tabaqat al-Atibba, which has been translated, actually. The whole thing's been translated in England and published by Brill. I read a few articles on his travels, on him, and on his autobiography. Subsequently, a fuller version of his autobiography was discovered and has been worked on. It's called the Kitab al-Nasihatain. And I read the Kitab al-Ifada wal-I'tibar, which is what this book is actually called. My Arabic was still okay, but not great. And so I read it in the translation, which actually has facing a facsimile reproduction of the Arabic and the English. What's spectacular about this translation is the translators, a husband and wife team, say that Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi appeared to them and told them that they should translate this book. And they did not know Arabic. And so they then enlisted the help of a Syrian judge who came over, and then they did it. Now, the translation is pretty good. But it's, I think, to my knowledge, the only text in our tradition, in the Arabic literary tradition, has been translated because the author appeared to someone 800 years later and told him to do it. But that should in no way detract from the fact that it's a fantastic work. It's his account. And this is why we gave it. So in the library, we give things titles that will attract English readers. I mean, the Kitab al-Ifada wal-I'tibar, the book of instruction and admonition, is not going to lead anyone to read it. And it is, in fact, a physician traveling to Egypt, and he's on the Nile. So we called it a description of Egypt and a journal of the famine years because it's in two parts. And the first part is a description of fauna and flora and climate, river, ruins, monuments, practices, history. And then he's there during a famine, and there's unspeakable horrors that he witnesses, which he also describes. He is a scrupulous observer, and to give you an idea of how important, I'm sure you already know this, but how important his observations are, Egyptologists today rely on his descriptions of monuments and things on monuments that no longer exist.
Right.
he was just extremely, he was a scientist, and he had the eye of a scientist, and he recorded and described. Famously, there's a passage where he describes cannibalism, which some people like to point to show that he was credulous. But he says, that he heard reports of this, and that things were really, really bad. And we know from other parts of planet Earth where there has been plague and famine and utter, desolation, that people do resort to this. So it is in no way diminishes his value as an observer. And I eventually abandoned my interest in Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi as a topic of a dissertation. It was one of my, Dwight Reynolds likes to say I had 95 dissertation topics at the time. He's been very well studied now. There are some important books on his philosophy, but my favorite book remains this one, and I'm thrilled that the library published it and that Tim McIntosh Smith agreed to translate it.
And then what I think stood out to me in this book is Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi was really kind of working through archaeological conservation and the importance of that in Egypt. Was that something that kind of stood out to you in this text? Was it something that you got really interested in because of that?
Yeah, no, I mean the whole book. I mean, when I was already enamored of him, and then when I read this book, I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, he's a traveler. I have a special interest in travel in the medieval period. I teach courses on it. He was a keen observer. This passage where he criticizes the preceding rulers for their absurd and just completely, in his view, irrational attitude towards the maintenance of monuments. And I hate saying this. I hate a particular thing that's said, and I'm going to say it now and contribute to the fact that it circulates, but I'll say it, which is he reads in the way that people who use this expression mean it, very modern. Right? He reads, so when my students read this, they say, oh my goodness, I never expected this. And I think that's what they mean. They mean because of their, it's not really prejudices, but because of their received ideas that someone in the 12th to 13th century couldn't have these progressive ideas. But of course, it's not progressive. It's simply someone who is, it was progressive even then, right? He was saying things that others weren't thinking, but it's not modern, right? It's just some people have, can value a human life or civilization or monuments in ways that others don't. For some, it's just it's just something there to be used or to be admired. And for him, it was a sign of human ingenuity, and as it inevitably is with most medieval pre-modern Arabic writing authors, also a sign of God's glory. And he thought that was important. So yes, it definitely struck me. It's still one of my favorite texts. I teach it every time I teach a travel course. And I'm teaching a course now called the Arabic Islamic Classics. And I had to limit myself to 9 or 10 books. And I'm teaching it on that course as well. I just think it's that important for students.
Yeah. I feel like I really want to read it now after kind of researching it a bit for our conversation. I mean, just even Egyptian grocers using recycled mummy wrappings as groceries.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and then as someone who's lived in Egypt, reading someone writing about mulukhiyya and bamia and and ul-as and this kind of thing, that's also a lot of fun, right? Because I've only ever spent protracted time in one country, which is Egypt. I've been to other parts of the Arab world, and so there's also that affinity. But that developed later. I read him before I went to Egypt. Perhaps that's part of the reason I chose Egypt. I don't know.
Right. I'm going to move us along to a work that you have an essay in, but it is an edited collection that you also edited. It's part of two books that we're discussing where you were on the editorial board that you mentioned have kind of a relevance with regards to being in honor or a tribute to somebody.
Yes, they're in honor of Everett Rowson, who is, simply put, one of the preeminent Arabists and philologists on planet Earth. And Joe Lowry, who's the other editor there, and myself were his graduate students. We actually inherited him in a way because George Maktasi, who was our initial supervisor, retired and recommended that he remained a mentor and super influential in what we did. In fact, it is Maktasi who introduced me to Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi. We decided that it was time to produce a festschrift, which is the practice in the field, a book in honor of one's teacher. And we put together the second volume we'll be talking about, Arabic Humanities, Islamic Thought. And we did it under a very tight schedule because we wanted it to appear in time to present to him at a meeting of a conference, an annual conference in the States, which we did. But that need to go very rapidly and edit properly and edit a text to the standard that he would edit something, right? Because he's an exacting editor. Everett Rowson served on the board of the Encyclopedia of Islam for a very, very long time as a superb editor. We realized we didn't have time to contribute something ourselves to our own volume in his honor. And so after this one came out, we decided to produce another one in which the two of us would also have contributions. And it so happened that a few people couldn't make the harsh deadline we set for this volume. So their material appears in the subsequent book, the one you're showing now, Arabic Belles-Lettres. So it's only, I believe, 10 pieces. And then we thought we would do something clever, a few clever things with this volume, because we could be playful with it, because it appears in a series that we ourselves edit, Resources in Arabic and Islamic Studies. So we have this beautiful, I think, beautiful statement at the beginning, Kul shay idha kathura rakhas illa al-adab, right? Which I think is one of the great, statements. We have a poem about a cat that's translated by David Larson. It's a beautiful translation by a brilliant translator of Arabic poetry. And Everett adores cats. In fact, there's a picture of him and his cat in the other volume in the front of it. And we thought we would do something sneaky. We included in this volume an article by him as well.
Oh, wow. And
we concealed these from him. These were both surprises. But I decided to include something I'd been meaning to write for a long time. And it has an interesting story. When Franz Rosenthal passed away, who's my predecessor here at Yale, I wasn't yet at Yale, I presented a paper about Ibn Abi Tahir's son. So Ibn Abi Tahir is the person I wrote my dissertation on. And I said, Rosenthal was Everett Rowson's supervisor. The German term for a supervisor is Doktorvater. So doctor father, right? Doctorate father. And I said, so here I am presenting a paper about the son of someone I worked on. And it's in honor of the father, as it were, of my own supervisor, my own father, my own, academic father. And I never published that. 18, 20 years later, I realized that I could write it, in fact, in a volume dedicated to my own supervisor. And I wrote about Ubaydullah ibn Ahmed ibn Abi Tahir because although Ibn Abi Tahir has gotten more attention now, I think only partly because of my work, but also because of important work being done in Iraq on him, and also work being done on his history. In fact, the Library of Arabic Literature will at some point soon be publishing the one surviving volume of Ibn Abi Tahir's history. His son doesn't get as much attention, and I thought it was important to point out something that Franz Rosenthal pointed out, which is that his work is probably more important than we realize. And so it was a real pleasure to be able to write that up and also put it in this volume and go back, as it were, to Baghdad, which is one of 9th and 10th century Baghdad is one of my favorite places to be in time and space.
Right. And I did want to ask a little bit about that. Like, what started your interest in that particular time and space? I know you're really interested in Abbasid work, and I know, like, with regard
So it's also an accident. It's also a total accident. So I come back I'm in Cairo in 88, 89 on a fellowship, a pre-doctoral fellowship, to study the influence of Adonis on Egyptian poets. And so the new generation, who are no longer the new generation because they're older now, but notably Abdul Munim Ramadan, a great poet, and others. And I had a kind of crisis about it and decided that because I couldn't find a way to talk about Adonis that was going to be satisfactory to my department and my advisors, I wanted to work on very, very focused collection, and they wanted something much more broad, which would have required talking about Antun Saada and Syria and political, and I just had no interest in that. And, I was young and I got annoyed. And I said, well, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to go back to the medieval period. So I called Makdisi and I said, Professor Makdisi, can I come see you when I'm back from Cairo? And I went to see him and I said, I don't know what to work on because I've decided not to work on Adonis. And he said, well, okay, what are you going to work on? And I said, no, well, that's why I've come to you. And he goes, I'm not going to tell you what to work on. You have to decide what you want to work on.
Yeah. And
so I said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, look. He said, GAS. GAS is the Geschichte des Arabischen Schriftums. It's a catalog of all the manuscripts that up to the year 1010 that are on the planet. He said, pick up volumes 1 and 2. 1 is on Quran and Hadith, 2 is on Adab. He said, pick them up and just go through. These are literary catalogs of manuscripts. And just pick out 4 people that look interesting to you and come back. So I do this. It takes me, a month. I come back to him and he says, do you have 4 names? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, what are the 4 names? And I tell him, now, because of 1010 as the cutoff date, and because I happened to pick slightly later figures, they inevitably were in Baghdad, right? I didn't pick early, Kufan Quran. I wasn't interested in Quran scholarship and Hadith scholarship as a field of inquiry. So I ended up being confined by that instruction to go to this work to Baghdad. I picked 4 names. I can't remember the 4th now, but the 3 that I remember were Yahya ibn Ma'in, who was a Hadith scholar, and Al-Madaini, who was an antiquarian, and Ibn Abi Tahir, who I ended up working on, who was a bookseller. And the reason that Ibn Abi Tahir attracted me is one of the books, it turns out it's not a book, but it's a volume from one of his larger books called the Kitab al-Manthur al-Manzoom. The volume title that attracted me was the Kitab Balaghat al-Nisa. And I thought, this is cool. A guy who's written about the eloquence of women, he has to be interesting. So when I give Makdisi the 4 names, he discounts the others and he says, Ibn Abi Tahir sounds interesting. Why don't you find out why he's interesting? And that was my mandate.
Those are also just such beautiful questions. I think I'm going to move us along a little bit to your work in the next book, A Maiden of Mauritius, which you mentioned that you're from your parents and you're married to someone from Mauritius. Can you talk a little bit about what this work has been like?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I already mentioned that when I was living there, I decided to work on Mauritian literature. And it was both a strategy for me to remain involved in literary studies. Not both. It was a strategy for me to remain in literary studies. It was a way for me to give, to help give Creole language Mauritian literature importance. I also worked on Anglophone and Francophone Mauritian literature. And I started to look at Urdu language literature. My Urdu is not as strong as it should be to do that kind of work. I think had I remained in Mauritius, so this was from 96 to 2000. I probably would have done that as well. And I had this idea of writing a kind of a multilingual history of Mauritian literature. And while I was there, I met a fantastic historian of Mauritius and of indenture, Marina Carter, who's based in England. And we began to collaborate on a few things, or I should say, she asked me to do things because she's the real scholar, the real historian. And we founded a little series called Cultural Legacies, in which we decided we would publish forgotten or underserved or anything that needed attention. And we did, the first thing that appeared was actually my translation of a Creole text. She has another series in which she publishes, and she continued to publish there historical things that were her own scholarship. And the next thing we worked on was this. She wrote to me and she said, the descendant of a judge who served in Mauritius found a manuscript by him as they were cleaning out the apartment that had been his granddaughter's or something. I'm forgetting the precise relationships. And there's a copy now at the Scottish National Library. And I've been approached, there's Marina, I've been approached to see if we can do something with this. What do you think? Do you think we should put it in our series? So I read it and I thought it was great. And I said, when I say great, what I mean is, I thought it was great that we would do this. I would not call this high literature. I don't think this really meets the standards, of a lot of my colleagues, but it was an interesting thing. It was Mauritius. It was a Scottish judge. And he was famous, not for his time in Mauritius, but for his time in the Caribbean and in Fiji for standing up to the colonial administration and its racism and the way that it would treat people of color. And that emerges somewhat in this book as well. Right. And so I said, sure, let's publish it. But the difficulty was that the people who brought it to us, whose names are there on the cover, so Marina's and my name are last, they're not scholars. They don't know how to edit. It's not a criticism. They don't do that. So we had to take over and do a bit of the work of editing. Marina and I wrote an introduction, and we also changed the title. So it was called A Maid of Mauritius, which at the time did not mean a servant and meant a young maiden. And so we advised the relatives. We said, we think going to work better if we do it on this title.
Yeah.
But then we got very invested in it because here we were working on this text, and I learned a lot about John Gorey, and I looked at, some archival material about him to try and get a picture of him. And it was fantastic to work on. And it maintained a connection to Mauritius, which I, by the way, recently visited. I visited in July for the first time in 7 years.
Wow. Okay.
So sometimes one's ties to a place, are genealogical and biological. In my case, they are that as well. I wasn't born there. It's not umbilical, but working on Mauritian literature keeps me, I feel like I maintain that connection.
Oh, that's so lovely. Okay. I'm going to move us to our quick Q&A.
Sure.
So what are you reading or watching right now?
So you kindly warned me that you'd be asking me these questions, so I prepared. So I'm reading Arabic poems by Marley Hammond, the Little Everyman book, which is a splendid little collection of Arabic poems with Arabic and English facing. I should point out, full disclosure, she's included something that I did in there, but that is not why it's an excellent collection. In fact, it would have been an even better collection. Maybe she picked someone else for my class, and I'm reading this for class next week because I assigned it in my Arabic Islamic classics. And I'm also rereading John of Salisbury's Polycraticus, which is a work of political philosophy and a mirror for princes that was written in the 12th century. Also for a class I'm teaching on the education of princes, but it's one of my favorite books. And one of the great things about being an academic is you can read new things for class, and you can also assign to your classes things that you love. Yeah. But in proper answer to your question, the thing I'm reading now, as opposed to class, is a book that just came out by a former colleague from Cornell called The Sonorous Desert.
Oh, that is beautiful.
And she had a project to try to understand what it meant that the early Christian hermits and ascetics would go into the desert to look for silence, and yet the desert isn't silent. It's full of sounds, water and insects and wind. And it's this beautiful, so the title is Sonorous Desert, What Deep Listening Taught Early Christian Monks and What It Can Teach Us.
Wow,
it's published by Princeton. It just came out. And she's a dear friend and a fabulous scholar. And it's just lovely to read a book, especially because it's also a kind of personal reflection on her scholarship and I'm sort of doing that with my Quran translation. So I'm very excited about that.
Who would you love to shadow for a day?
I have absolutely no idea, but I think the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Okay, that'd be fun.
The movie The Princess Bride.
What do most people misunderstand about your work?
Well, I've already mentioned it. They think that I'm trying to explain Islam or work on Islam or work out being a Muslim. Yeah. I think a lot of people just come to it with that baggage, and I can't do anything about that, but I think that's the most misunderstood. Yeah.
Whose work do you admire and are inspired by?
So in the field of translation, most immediately and most recently, Yasmin Seal, who's, I think, a luminous translator and poet. I'm a huge admirer of Peter Cole and his work on translation and poetry. And it's not an accident that it's translation and poetry, because this is what I'm doing right now. So I would say they are both inspirations. And then in my colleagues, I'm sorry to keep plugging them, but Devin Stewart, Joe Lowry, Philip Kennedy, James Montgomery, and certainly many others are an incredible inspiration to me because of their ability to balance their scholarship and their families, and also never take it all too seriously. Always realize that no matter how hard they work, those family and life and friends and relationships and peace in the world are more important than proving a particular point about Islamic law or Shiism or pre-Islamic poetry. I think that's critical. That they're just role models for me.
And then Usman asked the question, do you get a sense translations from Arabic are getting better? What future direction should it go in?
Yes, they're getting better because there are just more of them. And I think the more there is, the more we can scrutinize, the more we can compare, the more we can learn from our mistakes. But I think it's going much too slowly. And I think the reason it's going too slowly is we don't have enough robust vetting mechanisms in place. So a press, for example, someone will submit a sample. I'm speaking especially about academic translations, but someone will send a sample, the press will agree that it's very good or show it to someone, but then the person is on their own, and there's not really, if there's someone who isn't really getting feedback, people get away with things that are not as good as they could be. But there's no doubt that things are getting better, and it for everyone's benefit.
It was lovely seeing everyone today, and thank you so much, Shawkat, for being in conversation with me.
No, thank you. Thank you. This is fabulous. It's a real honor.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.